Usual, my colleague Mangoba Mchunu. Mangoba, very good morning to you. Let's just go back to Lord Peter Hain's testimony yesterday, saying that it's not good enough for banks to say, yeah, we had their accounts, but we've closed them down. They need to step up and take responsibility for their role and their complicity.
Of course, Desiree, and he says, the reason why he says this is because the banks should have been the first line of defense against, corruption and money laundering, because they have, the regulations, they have, all of the sort of the regulations that monitor money laundering. They should be aware when something like that happens. And of course, he says that it's simply not good enough for them to sit back and say, we didn't know, we didn't see it, because he says more than that. Besides that, there was increasing, public information through the media on the Gupta's shady dealings, and especially the relationship also with President Jacob Zuma coming under the spotlight. So he says at the time, the time of the Gupta leaks and so forth, there was information that was there in the public sphere. And of course, he says these banks chose to ignore this information. Instead, they were looking for profits and to make profits from the situation, and totally ignored the fact that this was happening. And he says this is totally unacceptable for banks to say that we simply didn't know, and they should take responsibility. He says they're equally also culpable for money laundering and the activities that went on there, and the criminal activities that took place at the time.
A lot of emphasis on HSBC, Standard Chartered and Bank of Baroda. Do you think that the Deputy Chief Justice took any notice of this focus on these three institutions?
Well, of course, these were the banks that were working with the Guptas at the time. We do know some of them, especially Standard Chartered was the bank that was used to launder monies in the Daily Dinner project, for example. So these were very notorious banks that had worked with the Guptas at the time. And of course, he says that he believes that these banks were actually enablers of state capture. He says they enabled the Guptas to siphon out monies out of the country. They actually opened the door to the Guptas, to the international network. And more than that, they actually helped them through what he says are professional enablers. That means bankers, lawyers, who actually help the Guptas to kind of create...
Professions we're supposed to respect.
Very, very, yes. Professions we're supposed to respect. But he says they help the Guptas, in legal terms, to actually create a network that, could help hide this money, a network
of systematic robbery, the word he used.
Yes, that's exactly what he used. That network that actually enabled the Guptas to be able to hide the monies that they took from state capture. And he says the bank, should be accountable in that sense. But I mean, the Chief Justice as well, one of the things that, came about at that time is that some of these banks obviously had denied their role in this, and they said that they simply were not aware,
and they continue to absolve themselves.
to absolve themselves from this responsibility. So we do know that some of them have actually been sent notices that they've been implicated, and still some of them till this day in their submissions to the commission are still denying their involvement.
Don't want to come forward. What was the response to his testimony? Because on social media it's quite divided. There are people who think he was awesome. There are people who say there's the colonial master once again wanting to tell Africans what to do.
I think, Desiree, judging from the comments on social media, I think many people had expected that there will be bombshells dropped at the State Capture Commission, new information coming out. But of course, at the beginning of his testimony, it indicated that the testimony that he's going to give is not based on any information or new information that he has, but based on information that is already in the public sphere. So many people expecting, hearing that it's a Lord Peter Hain from the UK, they were expecting that, he's going to have something that's gripping, something that's interesting and exciting. But of course, he was going over things that we already know. And that's where many people found, his testimony to some extent wanting. And I mean, some of them saying that, exactly as you've said, that it looks like, it's just one of those, again, white sort of people, telling us what to do.
Someone even commented that he still calls the Free State the Orange Free State.
Indeed. And you'll understand why. I mean, he's been out of the country for years. He grew up here as a young boy, but he's been out of the country. But yeah.
Let's look forward to today. Reverend Frank Chikane, what can we expect?
Well, we do know that Reverend Frank Chikane was very actively involved in calling out state capture, and in fact, in 2016, he was part of the Forum of DGs that actually had compiled a memorandum that they'd sent to various government departments and ministries calling for an inquiry into state capture. So those, of course, included also the former DG Themba Maseko, as well as the former NPA boss Vusi Pikoli. So they had penned this sort of memorandum to government departments calling for the inquiry, saying that they should look into the issue of how the Guptas are duly influencing the procurement procedures at SOEs and at government departments. Unduly, yes. Yeah. And again, he was also involved in that unburdening panel report. You recall that in 2017 there was a call by the South African Council of Churches for those who had information, for ministers and government officials who had information on state capture to come forward, that were actually scared to present it to officials, to come forward and present it to this panel. So they compiled also that panel report, which also highlighted state capture and how the Guptas had sort of mingled their way into government departments, SOEs and so forth. So he was actively involved in calling out, but beyond that, he's also in several utterances under the Save SA banner also called state capture a form of treason, saying that it was a form of treason that really needed to be addressed. And also he's been quite vocal in many platforms in calling out state capture. So again,
are we expecting any new revelations from him, something that will stick as opposed to the information that's already out there in the public domain?
Well, Desiree, not quite. I think maybe more than anything, he's going to repeat the same sentiment that we've heard from him. But more than that, maybe delve a bit deeper into some of the, information that they'd received while compiling that unburdening report, and of course some of the allegations, and maybe to some certain extent his own views of what he had witnessed, because he went as far as making very serious allegations that this money that was being laundered through state capture was actually going to be funding huge amounts of money
that Lord Peter Hain mentioned.
Yes, and he said about 1.5 trillion, if I remember correctly. And he said, of course, Chikane said at the time in 2017 that this money is going to again return to fund the
country budget, for goodness sake.
Indeed, yeah. Desiree. And at the time, Chikane had said that this money was that was also going to be used in elections to pay certain people to actually favor a certain candidate.
We need to wrap up, but just a quick one. A lot of frustration about decisiveness coming out of the commission. People worried that so much money is being spent on the commission itself, and yet we're not seeing any action coming out of the testimony that's coming out there.
Of course, but we do know that there are things that are happening behind the scenes, Desiree. For example, the Chief Justice mentioning that he had met, the Justice Minister on a few weeks ago. And also we do know that, he has also written to the Police Minister on the issue of the release of those, evidence that is classified and so forth. So there are some things that are happening. There is movement behind the scenes, but to what extent at this point, because there hasn't been any recommendation that has been made at this point, we're not sure what's going to happen. Where and how long it's going to take before we actually start to see tangible recommendations being made.
Let's release you. It's Parktown again. What time?
It's at 10 o'clock.
Thank you very much, Mangoba. Well, the state